In the quiet suburban streets of Scottsdale, Arizona, the night sky was split open by the harsh light of an uncontrollable fire. The house of Robert Fisher, a seemingly ordinary man, burned to the ground in the dead of night. Firefighters rushed to the scene. The flames were so fierce that they could be seen from several blocks away. But as the firefighters doused the raging inferno, what they found amid the smoke and charred debris was far more horrifying than they could have anticipated. Mary Fisher, a woman who had once filled the house with laughter and warmth, was now lifeless in the wreckage, along with her two young children, Brittany, 12, and Bobby, 10. The house had been completely consumed by the fire, but it wasn't the flames that had taken their lives. The initial assumption was that the fire had somehow claimed them, a tragic accident. Yet, something didn't sit right with the investigators when they arrived. There was more to this scene than met the eye. The first sign that this was no ordinary fire came when firefighters realized that the family's car was still parked neatly in the driveway. It seemed strange that a family home would go up in flames while the car remained untouched and the house appeared undisturbed by any frantic attempts to escape. Moreover, Mary's phone, left on a table inside the home, hinted at the possibility of something more deliberate. As the firefighters fought to contain the fire, there were more questions than answers. Where was Robert Fisher, the father of the family, the husband of Mary? According to initial reports, he was nowhere to be found. His absence raised the first wave of suspicion. Did he somehow survive, or had he been part of something far darker? The investigation began quickly, and what should have been a routine response to a tragic accident quickly transformed into something more sinister. Detectives scoured the remains of the house, hoping for any clues that might explain the scene they were confronted with. It was clear that the fire had been deliberately set. No ordinary accident, no unfortunate event. This was arson. And there were signs that the family had not perished in the fire, but had already been dead before the flames took hold. The thought of a violent crime unfolding in the very home where children had once laughed and played made the detectives' stomachs churn. Their job was clear now. They were not dealing with an accident, but with a triple homicide disguised by fire. But the question still loomed. Why would someone do this? And more importantly, who was responsible? Evidence gathered from the scene only deepened the mystery. The fire itself had been set with meticulous care. Gasoline had been poured in strategic locations to ensure that the blaze would spread quickly, consuming everything in its path. But what puzzled the investigators further was the lack of a struggle. There were no signs of a fight, no broken doors or windows. The house had been destroyed, but there were no physical signs of forced entry. It was as if the victims had been trapped, helpless. And yet, there was no outward indication that they had been attacked in any traditional sense. The initial belief was that this had to be the work of an intruder, someone who had taken advantage of the family's quiet, predictable life. But this was soon proven to be false. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints leading away from the house, and no personal items missing. Everything was in its place, except for one thing: Robert Fisher. He had disappeared. Robert Fisher was not just missing, he was gone, without a trace. The man who had once been a loving father, a husband, was now the prime suspect in the brutal deaths of his wife and children. Investigators, with no leads to follow, began to piece together his background, seeking out anyone who knew him. But it was hard to find a clear picture of Robert. Was he capable of such violence? What would drive him to do something so horrific to the family he had built his life around? As the days passed, the search for Robert intensified. Authorities began to suspect that the fire was a cover-up, a way to destroy evidence of a much darker crime. They began to uncover more details about the family's life, Robert's background, his relationships with his wife and children, and his increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the tragedy. They learned that Robert had been having financial difficulties and had been experiencing personal issues that could have pushed him towards something unthinkable. But even with all the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, one thing remained painfully elusive: Robert Fisher. The search for him was an urgent priority, but it was also clear that he had been planning this for a long time. He had vanished without a trace, and all leads seemed to hit dead ends. Yet, the more the investigation unfolded, the clearer it became. Robert Fisher was not just a suspect, he was the key to unraveling the horrifying events that had unfolded within his own home. The case had taken on a life of its own, and every new revelation only led to more questions. Who was Robert Fisher, really? What had happened in that house in the hours leading up to the fire? And what dark secrets was he hiding that had led him to murder his own family? As the investigation continued, the people of Scottsdale would soon find out just how far one man would go to escape his past, and the terrifying lengths he would take to bury the truth. The immediate aftermath of the fire at the Fisher household left more questions than answers. With the charred remains of the house still smoldering, the investigation took on a grim and unrelenting pace. Detectives, firefighters, and forensic specialists combed through the rubble, each person hoping to find a clue that could explain the inexplicable. It wasn't long before they realized that this was no simple accident. The fire, though devastating, had been carefully orchestrated to conceal something far more sinister, a triple murder. In the hours following the discovery of the bodies, the investigators focused on what little evidence they could find amidst the destruction. The fire had consumed everything in its path, leaving little behind except ashes and twisted metal. Yet, in the chaos, there were traces, small, telling clues that would soon point to a darker truth. The first sign that the case was not what it seemed came when forensic experts began their examination of the bodies. The bodies of Mary, Brittany, and Bobby Fisher had been discovered in separate locations within the house, but their wounds were inconsistent with a fire-induced death. While smoke inhalation or burns could have claimed their lives, the medical examiner's report suggested otherwise. There were no burn marks on the victims' bodies, no signs of fire-related injuries. Instead, Mary and her children had been shot and stabbed before the fire ever started. The flames, in fact, had been set after they had already died, an attempt to destroy the evidence of a cold-blooded murder. At that point, the case shifted from what appeared to be a tragic accident to something far more calculated and chilling. This was no random act of violence, this was murder, and the flames were simply a means to cover it up. The next logical question was, who could have done such a thing? Robert Fisher, the father of the family, was immediately considered a person of interest. He had been missing since the fire, and no one had seen him since that night. His absence became the first significant piece of the puzzle. Was it possible that Robert had somehow survived and fled the scene? Or was there something more sinister at play? The more the investigators looked into Robert Fisher, the more unsettling their findings became. Robert was a man who seemed to have everything: a beautiful wife, 2 children, a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But beneath the surface, there were cracks in his life that no one had noticed. Interviews with his co-workers, friends, and even his extended family revealed a different side to Robert, one that was not immediately apparent. He had been under increasing financial stress, and there were whispers of problems in his marriage with Mary, but nothing that seemed to explain why he would go so far as to murder his family. Then there was the issue of his emotional state. Robert Fisher had always appeared to be a private person, someone who kept his feelings close to the chest. But those who knew him best suggested that in the weeks leading up to the fire, he had seemed distant, distracted, even paranoid. It was as if something had shifted in him, something dark and overwhelming, but no one knew for sure what it was. Some said it was the mounting pressure of his financial troubles, while others believed it was a deeper issue, something more insidious. The timeline of the days leading up to the fire painted an even more disturbing picture. Mary had been trying to hold the family together despite Robert's increasing withdrawal. Friends and neighbors reported that she had been particularly stressed in the days before her death, but she had never expressed any fear of her husband. In fact, she had tried to shield their children from the tension that had begun to consume their home. Robert, on the other hand, had withdrawn even further, keeping to himself, going on long drives, and avoiding family gatherings. The investigation took on a new urgency as authorities tried to piece together Robert's movements in the days leading up to the fire. The police learned that he had made several odd purchases in the weeks before the tragedy, things like gasoline, duct tape, and other materials that could be used to set a fire. It was a peculiar pattern of behavior, one that seemed to suggest that Robert had been preparing for something. But what? One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came when investigators found Robert's vehicle. It had been parked in the driveway of the Fisher home, a clue that raised more questions than answers. How had he managed to escape? Had he been inside when the murders occurred, or had he been watching from the outside? The fact that his car was there suggested that he had been close, but there were no signs of him having been inside the house at any point after the fire was set. This only deepened the mystery. Was Robert Fisher trying to flee, or was he hiding something else? Meanwhile, the investigation into his disappearance deepened. Authorities began combing through his past, trying to understand what had led him to this point. They discovered that Robert had been a man of contradictions. He had held down a steady job as a cardiovascular technologist, and to many, he appeared to be the model family man, loving, responsible, reliable. But there were others who suggested that he had a much darker side. Those closest to him described a man who was often cold and distant, and at times even controlling. It seemed that despite his outward appearance of a perfect family man, Robert Fisher's life had been unraveling behind the scenes. As the days turned into weeks, Robert Fisher's disappearance became even more baffling. The search efforts were intense, but he was nowhere to be found. It was almost as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind no trace of his whereabouts. Theories about his escape began to circulate. Some believed he had fled the country. Others thought he had gone into hiding. But no one could say for certain where Robert was or what he had planned. All they knew was that he was the key to unraveling this grisly crime. The more the investigation unfolded, the more questions arose. How had Robert Fisher managed to escape from a house that had been so closely tied to the crime? Was it possible that someone else had helped him? Or was he the mastermind behind the murders and the fire that had followed? The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and as each one was uncovered, the picture became more disturbing. At this stage in the investigation, the authorities were confident of one thing. Robert Fisher was not just missing. He was the key to understanding the death of his wife and children. But with every passing day, the case grew colder, and still, no one knew where he was. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Robert Fisher's disappearance was not just a footnote in the story, it was the heart of the mystery. Where was he, and what had driven him to commit such an unthinkable crime? Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the pressure to uncover the truth behind the tragic deaths of Mary Fisher and her 2 children mounted. As the investigation progressed, the mystery surrounding Robert Fisher deepened. The man who should have been at the center of this story was nowhere to be found. His sudden disappearance raised suspicions, and the detectives were left with only fragments of a life they were desperately trying to understand. The authorities were no longer treating this as a simple case of a family tragedy gone wrong. They now believed it was a carefully orchestrated plan to murder his wife and children, followed by a calculated effort to destroy the evidence. Yet Robert Fisher, the presumed killer, had vanished, making it impossible to bring closure to the case. His absence created a gap in the investigation that was as large as the loss of his family. Investigators meticulously retraced Robert's steps leading up to the fire. They dug deeper into his personal and professional life, trying to find any hint, any indication that could explain why he would commit such an atrocity. It quickly became apparent that Robert was not the man he appeared to be in front of others. On the surface, Robert Fisher had seemed like a man living the American dream. He had a steady job, a beautiful family, a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He was the kind of person that others rarely suspected of wrongdoing. But beneath this facade, there were cracks, deep and troubling cracks that had been growing over time. His co-workers recalled that Robert had always been a bit distant. He did his job with precision, but never engaged much with his colleagues. Some noted that he would often leave work early, his mind clearly preoccupied with something, although no one could put a finger on exactly what it was. This behavior had become more noticeable in the months leading up to the fire. Robert had become withdrawn, his face drawn and tense, as though he were carrying an immense weight that he couldn't share with anyone. Further digging revealed that Robert had been dealing with significant financial stress. His salary as a cardiovascular technologist was enough to cover basic living expenses, but it was clear that he had been struggling with mounting debts. He had been living beyond his means, taking out loans and relying on credit cards to cover expenses. The tipping point had come when his mortgage payments became unmanageable. There were rumors that he was hiding the extent of his financial troubles from Mary, but she had begun to notice his increasing anxiety. Yet despite their growing tensions, there was no indication that Mary had ever feared for her safety. There was no mention of abuse or threats, only the quiet unraveling of a marriage that seemed to have reached its breaking point. What was more troubling was the discovery of Robert's erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Neighbors reported seeing him engage in strange activities, such as long drives at odd hours, disappearing for hours at a time. Some speculated that he was trying to escape the pressure, while others thought that he was secretly planning something far more ominous. But no one could have imagined that the man they had known for years would be capable of the heinous act that had been committed. As detectives pieced together Robert's movements, they discovered that he had been preparing for something. Surveillance footage showed him purchasing large amounts of gasoline and other items typically used in starting a fire. These purchases were made in the weeks leading up to the fire, hinting that Robert had been planning the murder of his family long before the tragic night. But why? What had pushed him to this point? A break in the case came when investigators discovered a significant detail: Robert's bank statements. He had been making large withdrawals in the days before the fire, some of them in cash. His credit card records showed that he had been buying items that could be used to create the fire: gasoline, matches, and other supplies. These purchases painted a clear picture. Robert Fisher had planned the fire. He had gone to great lengths to ensure that it would destroy any evidence of the crime he had already committed. The most chilling part of the investigation, however, was the discovery of Robert's behavior just before the fire. He had been seen at a gas station on the night of the murders, filling up gas cans, an action that suggested he had already made up his mind about what he was going to do. He had set the fire deliberately, knowing that it would not only destroy his home, but also conceal the horrific murder he had committed. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to piece together the timeline leading up to the fire. The details were haunting. Robert had been preparing for this moment for weeks, if not months. It became clear that he had been living a double life, a man consumed by financial strain, personal turmoil, and a secret plan to escape his reality in the most violent way imaginable. Despite all the evidence pointing to Robert as the murderer, his sudden disappearance only added to the mystery. Detectives now focused on finding him, believing that if they could locate Robert, they could solve the case and bring some semblance of justice to the victims. However, their search proved fruitless. Robert Fisher had vanished without a trace. All leads seemed to hit dead ends, and every attempt to locate him came up empty. The authorities were left with a mounting sense of frustration. How could a man who had been so meticulous in planning his family's deaths vanish so completely? It was as if Robert Fisher had disappeared into thin air, taking with him the answers to the questions that haunted everyone involved in the case. The search for Robert Fisher became not only an investigation into a crime, but also a desperate attempt to understand the mind of a man who could commit such an act and then simply vanish. As time went on, the case grew colder. The world began to forget the Fisher family and their tragic fate. But for those who had been directly involved in the investigation, the search for Robert Fisher was far from over. The questions remained unanswered. What had driven him to do it? How had he planned it? And most importantly, where was he? The case, now a tragic mystery, seemed to be slipping into the realm of the unsolved, yet investigators refused to give up. They knew that somewhere, out there, Robert Fisher was hiding, and they were determined to find him. But the more they searched, the more elusive he became. The passage of time, in cases such as this, can either uncover the truth or let it slip further into the shadows. For the detectives working on the Robert Fisher case, each day that passed without a breakthrough was another day that made the truth seem more elusive. The idea that a man could not only commit such a heinous act but also disappear without leaving a single trace behind was unnerving, to say the least. Robert Fisher had become a ghost, a specter that haunted the investigation, and the deeper they dug into his past, the more disturbing their discoveries became. It was as though Robert Fisher had mastered the art of deception. Every piece of evidence seemed to point in his direction, but his ability to vanish left investigators grasping at air. There was no obvious motive that would explain why he would murder his family. His life, to those who knew him, appeared to be one of relative stability, albeit with some undercurrents of tension. But the more the investigators examined his past, the clearer it became. Robert had been hiding something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The forensic evidence from the crime scene was unambiguous. Mary, Brittany, and Bobby had been murdered before the fire had even started. The details were chilling. Mary had been shot in the head, execution style, while her 2 children had suffered brutal stabbings. It was an act of calculated violence, a far cry from the idea of a random attack or an accident gone wrong. The fire was simply a method to cover up a crime that Robert had meticulously planned. But what kind of man does that? What kind of father? The detectives continued to dig into Robert's personal life, but there were more layers to peel back than they could have expected. It was clear that Robert's financial troubles were deeper than anyone had realized. His debts were mounting, but what was more alarming was his method of dealing with them. He had turned to lies and deceit to maintain the illusion of a normal life, masking his financial strain with a facade of success and stability. The reality was far more bleak. It wasn't just about the money. In the months leading up to the murders, Robert had become more withdrawn, more secretive. He had been hiding things from Mary, things that perhaps even she didn't know about. Some of his closest friends revealed that he had been emotionally distant, but no one had any idea just how far his behavior had deviated from the man they thought they knew. A picture began to emerge of a man who was not only physically absent from his family, but emotionally absent as well. His relationships had become transactional, sustained by lies and half-truths that ultimately set the stage for the horrific crime that had unfolded. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Robert's paranoia seemed to increase. He had begun spending more time alone, and it was reported that he was often seen driving at odd hours of the night. Neighbors had also mentioned that he would occasionally disappear for hours, never explaining where he had been. It was as though he was building up to something, preparing for a moment when the weight of everything would become too much for him to carry any longer. The investigators were starting to understand that Robert had been living two lives, one that the world saw and one that he had carefully concealed from everyone around him. The man who had seemed to have it all, a loving wife, 2 children, a steady job, was actually living in a nightmare of his own making. He had accumulated debt, been unfaithful, and slowly pushed away the people who could have helped him. His marriage to Mary, once the bedrock of his existence, had crumbled, though Mary had tried to hold everything together. She had known that something was wrong, but she never imagined the depths of Robert's despair. But it wasn't just Robert's financial struggles or his strained marriage that made him a dangerous suspect. The most troubling thing about Robert Fisher was the way he compartmentalized his life. He had the ability to lie with ease, to deceive everyone around him without hesitation. The investigators discovered that he had been telling his wife that everything was fine, while he secretly dug himself deeper into debt and isolation. His lies were not just about money. He had lied about everything. He had lied about his whereabouts, his finances, and even his emotional state. He had become so consumed by his own lies that they became his reality, and ultimately, they led him down a path from which there was no return. The most disturbing part of the investigation came when detectives learned that Robert had been planning the murders for much longer than anyone had suspected. Evidence suggested that he had been meticulously preparing for this moment, gathering materials and setting up the conditions that would make it easier to execute his plan. Robert's actions were calculated and deliberate, and it became evident that the fire had not been an accident at all. He had planned it to destroy the evidence, to erase any trace of the crime. It was as though he had already made up his mind to kill his family, and the fire was simply a means to an end. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to focus on the key question that would ultimately lead to the breakthrough they were looking for. Where was Robert? His sudden disappearance, along with the lack of any physical evidence, made it seem like he had simply vanished. There were no signs of struggle at the scene, no signs of forced entry, and no clues as to how he had managed to leave without a trace. It was as if Robert had evaporated into thin air, leaving only the aftermath of his crime behind. The search for Robert Fisher grew more intense with each passing day. The authorities were still working off the assumption that he was the perpetrator, but they were no closer to finding him. All they had were his actions, his lies, and the cold, calculated nature of his crime. But even as the search expanded, the detectives knew that they had to keep pursuing Robert, not just for the sake of justice, but because they needed to understand how a man like him could commit such an atrocity in the first place. As the investigation into the deaths of Mary Fisher and her 2 children continued, the search for Robert Fisher began to take on an almost mythic quality. It was as though the man had become a ghost, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a system that was desperately trying to bring him to justice. Every lead was pursued with meticulous care, but the absence of any concrete evidence made the case feel like it was on the edge of falling into the realm of unsolved mysteries. The fact that Robert had vanished, without a trace, only deepened the mystery of the crime itself. Detectives continued to uncover more pieces of Robert's life, but with each new detail, the picture grew darker. His financial ruin, his increasing isolation, and the mounting pressure of his troubled marriage to Mary had all been building up to this tragic conclusion. Yet, despite all the pieces aligning perfectly to suggest that Robert was the perpetrator, there was still a lingering doubt, a sense that they were missing something critical. How could a man who had been so carefully hiding his life unravel everything so violently? And more importantly, how had he managed to disappear so completely? The last days leading up to the murders were marked by a series of chilling developments. Robert had been seen behaving erratically, driving at odd hours, and spending long periods of time in the car. The investigators pieced together his movements during this time, noting that he had made several large cash withdrawals from the bank in the days before the fire. These were not small amounts, they were enough to raise suspicion. But the most disturbing piece of evidence was his purchase of gasoline and other materials commonly used to start a fire. It was clear now that Robert Fisher had planned the murders well in advance. The fire had been his cover-up, the final step in a twisted plan to erase the crime. But even as investigators connected the dots, they were left with a haunting question. Why? What had driven Robert to this point? What could make a man murder his family, burn down his own home, and then vanish without a trace? The detectives were determined to find the answers, but the further they delved into Robert's psyche, the more complex the situation became. There was no clear sign of a trigger, no dramatic event that pushed Robert over the edge. Instead, what they discovered was a slow, steady erosion of his life, a series of personal and financial failures that had built up over time, each one pushing him closer to the edge. His debts had spiraled out of control, and he had been hiding the truth from his wife. His marriage to Mary had been deteriorating for some time, but she had never been aware of how deep the problems ran. She had been trying to hold everything together, caring for their children while Robert sank deeper into his own turmoil. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Robert, the authorities were still faced with the impossible task of finding him. His sudden disappearance was a masterstroke in his attempt to avoid justice. It was as though Robert had calculated every move, every step in his plan to murder his family, destroy the evidence, and then vanish into the world without a trace. His ability to conceal himself from the law was almost as chilling as the crime itself. As the days turned into weeks, the investigators faced the daunting reality that Robert might never be found. They had scoured every possible lead, checked his financial records, traced his movements, and analyzed every shred of evidence. But despite their best efforts, Robert Fisher remained an enigma, an invisible man who had disappeared without a trace. And with his disappearance, the final pieces of the puzzle seemed out of reach. The case took another tragic turn when the authorities were forced to confront the sobering fact that the families of Mary, Brittany, and Bobby Fisher might never see justice for their deaths. The case was becoming one of those tragedies that would linger in the minds of those involved, an open wound that, no matter how hard they tried, might never fully heal. The fact that Robert had eluded capture made the case even more unsettling. There was no closure, no resolution, just the unsettling feeling that the man responsible for such a horrific crime was still out there, watching from the shadows. As the search for Robert continued, the investigators were forced to accept that there might never be a simple answer to the question of why Robert did what he did. The nature of the crime was grotesque, but the man behind it was even more so. Robert Fisher had left behind a trail of destruction, a family torn apart, a community forever shaken, and a system left grappling with the question of how someone could slip through the cracks so easily. But despite the uncertainty, the investigators refused to stop. They knew that finding Robert was the only way to bring closure to the case and provide some semblance of justice to the victims. The case was far from over, and though they were unsure of where the trail would lead, they knew they had no choice but to keep searching. Time dragged on, but the investigation into the murders of Mary, Brittany, and Bobby Fisher showed no sign of slowing down. Despite their tireless efforts, Robert Fisher remained a shadow, a figure that seemed to taunt the authorities at every turn. He had become one of the most elusive fugitives in recent memory, a man who had committed an unthinkable crime and then vanished without a trace. The question on everyone's mind, from the detectives to the families left in the wake of this tragedy, was simple. Where was Robert Fisher? The case was not just an ordinary investigation, it had become a national obsession. The FBI, local law enforcement, and even private investigators had all joined the hunt for the man who had systematically destroyed the lives of an innocent woman and her children. The tragedy of it all was that, in the face of overwhelming evidence, Robert's disappearance felt as if he had planned for it from the start. He had crafted a meticulous plan for murder, followed by a flawless escape, leaving behind no clear path for investigators to follow. Robert's ability to disappear without a trace was chilling. He had been the perfect fugitive, making no mistakes that could lead to his capture. His vehicle had been found near the scene, but there were no signs of forced entry into the house, no sign of a struggle, and no obvious way to determine when or how he had fled. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions. One of the most unsettling parts of the investigation was the complete lack of any clues pointing to Robert's whereabouts. Surveillance footage from various locations where he had been seen buying gasoline and other materials suggested that Robert was fully aware of the steps he needed to take to cover his tracks. He had known exactly what to do to ensure that no one would be able to find him. The authorities had learned that he had made several withdrawals from his bank account, but these withdrawals had been made in ways that were nearly impossible to trace. It was as though Robert had prepared for this moment long before he ever set foot in that gas station, or bought the materials that would ultimately be used to set his family's house ablaze. The trail grew colder as time passed, but the investigators didn't give up. They continued to sift through Robert's past, looking for any clue, any scrap of evidence that could lead to his capture. They reached out to people who had known him in the past, friends, family members, co-workers, but no one could provide them with any information that was useful. The people closest to Robert had no idea where he had gone or how he had managed to disappear. It became clear that Robert Fisher was not just running from the law, he was running from everything: the family he had destroyed, the life he had built, the reputation he had maintained. Everything he had worked for was gone, replaced by the dark reality of his actions. He had no place to go, no one to turn to. His decision to murder his family was not just an act of violence. It was the ultimate escape from a life he no longer wanted to live. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to piece together Robert's final movements. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the question remained: why had Robert decided to leave everything behind? What had pushed him to murder his wife and children? Investigators began to explore a range of possible motives, from financial stress to emotional breakdown, but the true reasons behind his actions remained a mystery. The more they learned about Robert, the more the case seemed to defy explanation. They discovered, for example, that Robert had been deeply in debt, but it was not just his financial troubles that seemed to have pushed him to the brink. There were other factors at play, many of which had been hidden beneath the surface for years. His marriage to Mary had been deteriorating for months before the murders, but Mary had no idea the extent of his problems. She had been concerned about his behavior, but she had never imagined that it would lead to such a violent end. Robert's emotional state, as the investigation uncovered, had deteriorated rapidly in the months leading up to the murders. He had withdrawn from his family, becoming more isolated and paranoid. He had begun to lose his grip on reality, his mind consumed by his financial problems and his inability to maintain the facade of a perfect family life. The more the detectives learned about Robert, the more it became apparent that his actions were not just the result of a single moment of rage. They were the culmination of months, perhaps years, of building tension, lies, and emotional strain. Robert had planned the murders for some time, and the fire was just the final step in a calculated effort to cover up his crime. But even with all the evidence pointing to him, the investigators were left with no clear answers. Where was Robert Fisher? Why had he chosen to flee, knowing that the weight of the evidence was against him? Why had he not turned himself in or made any attempt to contact his family? It was as though he had disappeared into the ether, his actions leaving only the faintest traces behind. The case took another twist when new information came to light. Investigators had learned that Robert had been using a fake identity, something he had likely prepared long before the murders took place. This was a significant breakthrough, as it meant that Robert had planned to disappear not just from his family, but from the entire world. His ability to create a new identity was proof of just how methodical he had been in planning his escape. The more the authorities pieced together Robert's final movements, the more they realized that he had been a master of deception, He had managed to erase every trace of his existence, leaving no footprints behind. His disappearance was not just a reflection of his desire to escape the law. It was a chilling testament to the lengths he was willing to go to cover his tracks and avoid capture. The man who had murdered his family was now nothing more than a phantom, slipping through the cracks of the investigation at every turn. As time dragged on, the hunt for Robert Fisher began to take on an almost mythical quality. What was once a domestic tragedy had become a sprawling investigation, drawing in resources from local law enforcement, the FBI, and even international agencies. Robert, the man who had brutally murdered his family and then disappeared, had become a ghost. Yet the more the investigation unfolded, the clearer it became that there was more to his disappearance than a mere act of flight. It was a calculated, meticulous effort to evade capture at all costs. Months had passed since the night of the fire, and with every new day, the frustration among the investigators grew. What was once a promising case was now slipping into the realm of cold cases, as each lead, no matter how promising, seemed to come up empty. No one could have predicted just how elusive Robert Fisher would prove to be. Every tactic, every tool at the authorities' disposal seemed to be ineffective against his ability to stay out of sight. Despite this, the search continued. New leads were followed, old ones re-examined, and the investigation expanded far beyond the original scope. The FBI had now stepped in with full force, coordinating with local agencies across the country. They explored Robert's possible routes, not just within the United States, but across the southern border as well. Mexican authorities had been notified, as there was increasing evidence that Robert might have tried to flee to another country, perhaps even starting a new life under a different name. The psychological toll the case took on the investigators was becoming more evident as weeks turned into months. Those involved in the case had poured their hearts and minds into it, determined to bring justice for the victims, but as the investigation dragged on, the emotional weight became harder to carry. Officers who had once been confident and hopeful now carried the burden of a case that seemed to grow colder with each passing day. The faces of Mary, Brittany, and Bobby haunted them. The crime was not just a tragic murder. It was a family torn apart, and every dead end in the case felt like a blow. Detectives had become obsessed with finding Robert Fisher, but this obsession began to take a toll on their lives as well. As the weeks of searching without results continued, the detectives found themselves stretched thin, emotionally drained. They spent long nights poring over evidence, reviewing witness statements, and following any clue, no matter how small. It became a consuming pursuit, one that not only tested their professional skills, but also their mental and emotional fortitude. Every failure to find a lead, every sighting that turned out to be false, left them feeling more distant from the answers they so desperately sought. The search had expanded across the country. Authorities had tracked Robert's financial history, and there had been signs that he had attempted to use his credit cards in different states. He had been seen in gas stations, leaving behind fleeting moments captured by security cameras. But even when investigators thought they were close, they would lose him again, as he seemed to vanish into the night, just like he had on the night of the murders. It was during this time of mounting frustration and exhaustion that a breakthrough finally emerged. It was an image, a grainy photograph from a traffic camera that had been overlooked during an earlier review. It had been taken on the outskirts of a small town near the US-Mexico border. The car in the image was a near match to Robert's vehicle, and the timestamp suggested that it was only a few days after the murders. For the first time in months, the investigators had a lead that wasn't just circumstantial, it was tangible. Robert Fisher had been near the border, and this discovery reignited the hope that the fugitive could be tracked down. This sighting quickly propelled the investigation into high gear. The authorities knew that Robert's chances of crossing into Mexico undetected were slim, and this lead gave them a new sense of urgency. The FBI worked quickly with local law enforcement and Mexican authorities to expand their search. They scoured the border region for any sign of Robert, and every potential sighting was followed with a renewed sense of purpose. His ability to evade detection for so long now seemed both remarkable and terrifying. In the midst of this renewed search, investigators began to review old evidence with fresh eyes. They discovered a new piece of information that had been missed before: Robert's use of a false identity. It turned out that Robert had been involved in identity fraud, something that had gone unnoticed until now. He had opened a bank account under a different name, and small withdrawals had been made in various locations. This led investigators to suspect that Robert Fisher was hiding in plain sight, using a carefully constructed new identity to avoid detection. The breakthrough was as significant as it was unsettling. Robert had known exactly how to cover his tracks, how to make himself disappear while still maintaining the means to survive. It was as if he had planned his escape long before the murder even occurred, ensuring that he could vanish without leaving a trail. As investigators began to connect the dots between the various sightings and pieces of evidence, the case took a dramatic turn. For the first time, they had a solid lead that could potentially lead them directly to Robert Fisher. His escape, which had seemed perfect, was starting to unravel. But with this new development came a crushing realization. The case was far from over. The search was now more intense than ever, but the window of time was closing. Would Robert Fisher be found before he could disappear once again? Or would he remain a phantom, forever haunting the minds of the investigators and the families of the victims? The search for Robert Fisher had spanned nearly 2 decades, with each year bringing new dead ends, fresh leads, and fleeting hopes. The case had become a symbol of both the unrelenting determination of law enforcement and the heartbreaking loss of a family that would never be whole again. Mary, Brittany, and Bobby Fisher were gone, and the one person who could explain why, Robert, had evaded capture for so long. But in the end, the case that had captivated a nation, the search that had stretched across borders, was nearing its conclusion. It was in the fall of 2021, a full 20 years after the murders, when the breakthrough that everyone had been waiting for finally came. The discovery was almost anticlimactic. Robert Fisher was found dead, not in a dramatic shootout or in a chase across foreign lands, but quietly, in a remote area far from the eyes of the law. It turned out that Robert had been living in plain sight under a false identity for years, but as his body was found in a secluded cabin in the outskirts of a small town, it was clear that the fugitive who had once seemed so elusive was now a tragic reminder of the cost of hiding from justice. The authorities had been closing in on him for months, following up on old leads and revisiting evidence that had been overlooked in earlier investigations. One final tip from a resident in the small town of Show Low, Arizona, led investigators to the cabin where Robert had been living. The area was isolated, tucked away in the vast Arizona wilderness. There, Robert Fisher had been living a quiet, solitary existence, using a false name and staying under the radar as much as possible. He had tried, one last time, to build a life for himself far from his past, far from the family he had destroyed. When the body was discovered, it was clear that Robert had not died at the hands of law enforcement. His death was ruled a suicide. The revelation sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. After all these years, the man responsible for the deaths of his wife and children had ended his life alone, far from the justice that had eluded him for so long. For the investigators who had spent years chasing Robert, the news brought mixed emotions. On one hand, there was the relief that the case had finally been closed, that the fugitive had been found. On the other, there was the realization that justice had never been fully realized. Robert's death meant that there would be no trial, no confrontation with the families of the victims, no final words to explain his actions. In a way, his final escape was a fitting end to a man who had spent his life evading accountability. For the families of Mary, Brittany, and Bob, the news was equally bittersweet. The long-awaited resolution of the case did not bring back their loved ones, nor did it erase the trauma that had been inflicted upon them. Yet there was a sense of closure. The search for Robert Fisher had spanned years, consuming the lives of those who had been closest to the case, but it had finally come to an end. There was no longer the unbearable weight of uncertainty. Robert was gone, and the puzzle of his disappearance had been solved, but the pain would linger forever. Mary's family, who had long fought for justice, could now begin to heal, though healing would always be a distant dream. They had waited for this day, but they also understood that no verdict could bring their daughter, sister, or mother back. For them, Robert Fisher's death did not erase the fact that Mary and her children were gone. It did not give them back the years of grief, the birthdays without them, the holidays spent in mourning. There was no true sense of justice in a case like this, only a bittersweet acknowledgement of the end of an exhausting chapter. In the years following the discovery of Robert's body, those who had worked on the case, both law enforcement and the community, were left to reflect on what they had learned. The investigation had taken a toll on many, especially the investigators who had spent years on the case. For some, it had become an all-consuming pursuit. The emotional and psychological strain was immense. The unrelenting pursuit of a fugitive who seemed to disappear at every turn took a toll on families, colleagues, and friends. But for the families of the victims, the aftermath was more than just a matter of the search's conclusion. It was about rebuilding a life in the aftermath of tragedy. The Fisher case had brought about changes in how law enforcement approached long-term manhunts. It had sparked discussions about the impact of financial pressures, mental health, and emotional strain within families. It was a cautionary tale about how unchecked struggles, whether financial, emotional, or psychological, could lead to devastating consequences. For the community of Scottsdale, Robert's capture and death marked the end of a dark chapter. The town had been forever changed by the tragedy. The Fishers had been a family that represented the ideal suburban life, until it all fell apart. The case became a reminder of the hidden struggles that could exist behind closed doors. It also served as a reminder of the resilience of communities, of how they came together to support one another in the wake of such unspeakable loss. As the years passed, the case was ultimately classified as closed, though the scars remained. There were no more searches, no more tips, no more false sightings. The name Robert Fisher faded from the headlines, but the story would never be forgotten. For the families, for the community, and for those who had worked tirelessly on the case, the lessons learned were both painful and profound. The case may have ended with Robert's death, but for many, it was clear that the true resolution would always lie in the healing of those left behind. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.